Good morning to everyone. Hope everyone's well. It's a beautiful fall day. And speaking of which, a couple of quick things as we get started today. Tonight is our annual fall festival and trunk or treat. So for anyone out there who is anxious to get into costume, they tell me to just limit that to the kids, but I'm going to say any adults that want to come in costume tonight too, that is roundly encouraged. And so come on out tonight, 6:15 after our evening worship. We're going to be out kind of in and around the summit, this building out here to our north. If you're a guest here today, we invite you, come on over. We've got candy, we've got games, we've got just a fun time to celebrate the fall together. And so that'll be 6:15 to about 7:30 or so. Bring your kids through the 6th grade. They can dress up and come and go through our trunk or treat cars and then come inside in the gym, and we'll have carnival games and things like that to do. So that is tonight. We still could use more candy, so if you want to bring up candy before the event, we've got kind of boxes out there in the lobby, or you can bring those over to the summit with you tonight, and we appreciate that help as well. Next Sunday, I want to remind you that we are kind of kicking into gear with all of our different holiday giving projects, and that'll kind of start with the fall food drive. So next Sunday morning, or anytime next Sunday really, just bring your bags of groceries. We hope to put as many of those bags as we can up here on the stage. It is definitely time to restock our pantry to help with people here in our community, in the Luther community down at Capitol Hill. And so bring those items. You can find those lists of items kind of at our normal pickup spots here in the building, or those are also on the app. And we always appreciate your help with that. So the next several weeks are going to see us introducing a lot of different opportunities for you to give back and be part of some really good efforts to bless people in our community. All right, well, to get started this morning, I want to ask you to take a look at the collection of faces that's popping up here on the screen, and I want you to tell me what those people have in common. Just anyone. Any notions? Okay, it's got celebrities, that's right. You probably recognize most, if not all, of those faces. They're famous. Anything else? What? Okay, I heard someone say disgraced. That's kind of what I want to focus on a little bit today. So these aren't just famous people. All of these people have actually been fired from jobs as high-profile endorsers of a company or product. And so you'll see kind of the companies that they've been fired from popping up here on the screen. And there's different reasons for that. They kind of range. Their termination cause, I guess, ranges a little bit. Some of them are really bad and kind of awful reasons. Some of them are not nearly as egregious, but all of them have been let go from these companies for one reason or another. So how do these relationships work? You know, why would a brand hire a person to start with? Well, the short of it is that they want us to be attracted to their products, right? They want consumers to be attracted to have confidence in them as a company and in the products that they have to offer. And so they want spokespeople who are going to either be extremely successful or likable or relatable or attractive, because they want us to associate those same qualities with their products, right? With that brand. And so if Beyonce drinks Pepsi, well, maybe I should drink Pepsi, right? Because Beyonce is just objectively fabulous. And I really kind of like to be fabulous, but I'm not quite there yet. I can't describe myself quite as fabulous, but maybe if I drink Pepsi, I'll get there. Or wait a minute, you're telling me that Chuck Norris wears Action jeans? Really? Well, first of all, tell me why I've never heard of Action jeans. And then tell me where I can buy some, because I would obviously be doing that constantly if I just had the right pair of pants. You know, it's literally the only thing preventing me from doing that all the time. Or wait a minute, you're telling me that Ozzy Osbourne eats I Can't Believe It's Not Butter? Well, I don't even quite know what to do with that information, actually. Does that make me less likely or more likely to eat? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just kind of confused and kind of vaguely troubled by that association. I don't really know what to do with that. But, you know, there's a lot riding on this for these brands, right? On these endorsements. Obviously, there's a lot of money spent. There's a lot of time and effort spent deciding who should be the perfect endorser for our company, because that person is going to represent that product or that company to the public. For all intents and purposes, they are now the face of that brand. And so because of that, what they do matters. Their actions, their words, their behaviors, all of those things are going to be closely scrutinized by the companies that have hired them, because the entire reason for hiring an endorser in the first place is so that consumers will take the positive feelings that they have about that person and apply them, even if they're doing it subconsciously, to the product that person is selling. And so the danger of that, of course, is that the opposite of that rule also holds true. If my feelings about someone turn from positive to negative, then that company has a problem. Nike doesn't want to be known for things like cheating and doping. And so, sorry, Lance Armstrong is no longer a viable spokesperson for Nike because his behavior, he didn't live up to the standards and the values that Nike wants their brand to be known for. Or let's say you're the Beef Industry Council in 1986, and you're trying to find the perfect spokesperson for your brand new Real Food for Real People campaign. Well, if you're going to start a campaign like that, obviously you need someone grounded, right? Just someone humble, someone very relatable, just a salt-of-the-earth beef eater, right? So who do you turn to? You turn to Sybil Shepherd. That's who you turn to. Obviously, it's the obvious choice. No one screams relatable like Sybil Shepherd. And so just a few months into the campaign, Sybil Shepherd says publicly on the record, well, I actually stay away from red meat. Well, that's not ideal. That's hilarious, because could there be a less ideal statement for your Beef Industry Council endorser to make than that? So you fire Sybil Shepherd. You probably fire the person that suggested her in the first place. And what does all of that have to do with what we're doing here this morning? What does it have to do with the vision of Jesus? Well, just a couple of weeks ago, Phil introduced this series on the Sermon on the Mount. It basically is looking at the vision that Jesus has for how his people should be here on this earth. And it's part of our plan to get stronger as a church, to grow stronger as Christians and as a collective Christian body, so that we will be better able to reach the close to 20,000 people, if you remember, in our immediate community who claim no relationship with Jesus or with a church. And so that's what we're doing in this series. If you haven't listened to the first couple of lessons, or if you just want to catch up, go online, go on our app. They're really good messages. But like I say, the gist of it is, this is Jesus' vision for how he wants his people to be. And it's not just some pie in the sky, fantasy land sermon, as Phil said in the first week. This is not just a lesson designed to prescribe this impossible standard that can't possibly be lived up to as a matter, as a way to endorse grace and to promote the idea of grace. This is a sermon that's preached so that it can be lived. To the best of our ability, it's meant to be lived. And so it's Jesus laying out for his followers his expectations of them as representatives of him. We are to be endorsers of Jesus and his story. And I don't mean for that analogy to sound crass. Obviously, a celebrity endorser is paid to do a job. Obviously, Christianity is not just some product or brand. And so the stakes here are much higher. They're much more meaningful. But the dynamic is actually just the same. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is him saying, look, you've claimed me as your Savior. You've said that you are going to follow me. And so your actions, your words, your beliefs, your attitudes, your behaviors, all of those things are now a direct reflection on me. You are representing me and my Father in this world around you. And so because of that, I am calling you to a higher standard. To the highest standard, as a matter of fact, because my way is not just the best way, it's actually the only way for you and for everyone else to connect with the creator of the universe. Those are the stakes. And so when people are watching you, and they are watching you, by the way, I want them to see the best of what that way has to offer, the best of my way, not just some ugly, disappointing distortion of it. That's what the sermon is about. Now, to start off, of course, thank God for grace, right? Because that is a very tall order, and yet at the same time, this is a sermon taught so that it could be lived, so that the world could see the values and even the attributes of God and of his Son in the lives and in the faces of the people who call themselves Christians here on this earth. And so when we do it, When we put the sermon into practice, we're actually showing the world something very subversive, something that's upside down, something that's counterintuitive to the expected. We present this bold, graceful, righteous alternative to what the world and what society so often has to offer. You know, that opportunity that we have to live in a way that challenges the cultural norm, well, that's on full display as Jesus handles the subject of anger in Matthew chapter 5. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be in Matthew 5, and so we're going to jump right into it, beginning in verse 21. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, you leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift." And so Jesus leads off here with those words, "You've heard that it was said." And that's going to be kind of his oratory device that he's going to use over the next 6 sections of his sermon. And as he uses those repeatedly, they kind of become the shorthand for his radical subversion of the expected, the known, the familiar. You know, at the same time as he's doing that, I think it's really important for us to remember what we talked about last week, that yes, Jesus did want to upend the status quo in his teaching here, but even still, he's very clear that the life he is calling his followers to, when it's practiced, is actually going to more fully realize and not replace the law that his listeners know so well, know so intimately. And so that's why before he starts delving into any of the specific subjects that he addresses, he lays the groundwork for what he's about to do by saying those words that we read last week. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so it's with that introduction, in that context, that Jesus jumps into a topic that actually would have been pretty top of mind for his audience. As I was kind of reading about these verses, about this subject, I was noticing, it was interesting to note that a lot of scholars point out that those Pharisees, those teachers of the law that he just talked about in the preceding verses, were evidently engaged in a contemporary debate about the proper application of the sixth commandment, which says, do not kill. And so the religious authorities of the day are apparently teaching people that they've come to the conclusion that the right application of that commandment should be restricted to the deed of murder alone, to the act of homicide. And that is an interesting question, of course. It's one that Christians and non-Christians alike have argued and debated for centuries. You know, do not kill? Yeah, I think hopefully we can all agree on that. But what about war? What about capital punishment? I mean, those are interesting and heady debates. I've been a part of some of those discussions. You probably have as well. And so the debates about murder, the possible caveats to it, are nothing new. And they are interesting. They're not unimportant. Jesus could have chose to engage that specific conversation. What he chose to do instead is, you're missing it. That's what he's telling people. You're missing it. You're talking about a very specific and even extreme application here, but you're missing the point. Because the topic, the true scope of what my followers need to consider is much broader, much wider than that. Let's get down to the heart of the issue. What's underneath murder and physical violence? And so while my NIV Bible labels this section murder, I think the better heading is actually anger. That's what Jesus is talking about in this. And it's by reframing the message to challenge his followers to control their natural anger rather than just avoid physical violence against each other. Well, Jesus does something that then becomes a theme in the sermon. He universalizes the problem, right? Because we can all talk about what the proper application is of that sixth commandment. We can talk about those things, but whether we're talking about homicide or we're talking about capital punishment or even war, for most of us, not all of us, but most of us, those are just thought exercises. Those are just dinner table debates. But anger, on the other hand, the root cause of the act of unrighteous violence, well, that's something that every single one of us has to contend with in actual practice. And to say that our words and even our thoughts are subject to the same judgment as our deeds, well, that is a radically challenging idea. I mean, that would be absurd in the eyes of most people, but that is the life that God is calling his people to. And so now everybody, not just potential murderers, are in the sights of Jesus. And he goes on to warn us against two specific examples, two scenarios, or I guess expressions of what anger looks like. And I think with these specific examples that he offers up together in the full context of the sermon, he's showing us the really negative, impactful consequences of what happens when we don't master our anger. And the first of those two principles that I'd like us to pull out of Jesus' words this morning is this: unrighteous anger that flares diminishes your witness. Unrighteous anger that flares diminishes your witness. The first scenario that Jesus describes involves the exchange of insults between people. Remember, he says, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin, but anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Your Bible probably has footnotes. Those footnotes probably tell you that that word raka there is an Aramaic term of contempt. There's been a lot of debate and discussion over the years about these insults. You know, just how bad are they? Just how offensive are they? How would they have seemed? What would have been their role in their contemporary context? What's the proper translation of those insults into a modern context? Just how literal is Jesus being in his words here? And so there's been a lot of discussion about that. And again, those are not uninteresting or insignificant conversations. But to me, the heart of the matter is something a little bit different. Again, the words themselves, he's simply using the same progression, the same pattern that he used at the beginning of this section when he said, you've heard it was said, don't kill. I'm telling you, don't even be angry with each other. He's using that same progression here. He said, you've heard it said, don't say raka. That's going to put you in front of the Sanhedrin. That's serious, yes. I'm telling you that actually the bar's higher. Even if you say fool to your brother, you're going to be answerable to an even higher authority than the Sanhedrin. So it's that same pattern again. But the heart of the matter is that Jesus is calling us to recognize just how damaging it is when we lash out in anger against each other. And he's calling us to drastically, not just incrementally, but to drastically elevate the civility of our behavior toward one another. That's what he's doing with these words. So much of the sermon, if we read the whole thing from start to finish, so much of it is Jesus telling us kind of simply, look, you have to treat people better. You have to love people much better than the standard that the world prescribes. And so you see words like be merciful, be peacemakers, stop lusting after each other, honor your covenants that you have with each other, be forgiving, love your enemies, give to those that are needy, don't judge each other, don't be angry with each other. He's saying treat people better. Because Jesus treated people better first and foremost, but also because other people are watching. This example that Jesus uses of people who insult each other is an example of anger playing out in a public, visible, observable way. And we've all heard that said. It's probably been said to us. We may have said it to our kids or whoever, that people are watching. People are watching us as believers specifically to see how our walk lines up with our talk. And yet how often do we get mad about something and let that emotion just steamroll us and obliterate that fact that we know people are watching? It happens all the time. But we are representing something much bigger than ourselves on this stage of our daily lives. And when we treat people poorly, it not only hurts that person, it also does hurt the cause of Christ. That's not an overstatement. That can't just be an empty platitude in our lives. A couple of years ago, at our last big marriage retreat, I told a story about myself that I'd never told in public before. And the reason is pretty simple, because I don't like to tell it. It's a hard story to tell. It's embarrassing. Frankly, I hadn't planned on telling it this morning, but as I was kind of mentally sorting through all of the countless different examples that I could use of people letting their anger publicly get the best of them, this little voice in the back of my head kept getting louder and louder and is saying, look, Andy, Why are you trying to pin this on someone else? You have no shortage of apt examples and apt stories from your own life that would be perfectly applicable here, you nitwit. That's what it was saying. I basically said raka to myself. I kind of raka'd myself. And I don't know if that's cool. I can't tell from the text if that's okay. But anyway, the voice was right. The voice was right. And so here's a brief version of that story that I told. A few years ago, several years ago, my family and I walk into this Brahms right down here on Memorial Road, and we're intending to get some dinner. Now, I'll say that there's probably no place on this earth more likely to provoke me to unrighteous anger than this Brahms down here on Memorial Road. But that's just me making excuses for bad behavior. So strike that comment from the record. Disregard that. We're going in. We're standing at the counter, and the girl at the register is having a hard time getting the order right. It's taking a really long time. She's having trouble with it. I'm getting frustrated. And at one point, I asked for some modification or some change to the order, and she told me that, and the words were that went against Brahms' policy. And I kind of just snapped. I raised my voice at her. I got sarcastic with this poor girl at the register. And I ended up just saying to Summer and the kids way too loudly, I was like, just forget it, we're leaving, come on, get out. And I storm out of the restaurant and them kind of sheepishly following me. I cringe telling that. I really do. I cringe telling that. I'm embarrassed by that. It was totally rude. It was uncalled for. It was just really bad form on my part over obviously something very insignificant. I'm embarrassed and ashamed about that. Obviously, Summer was too. She was mortified. Her resulting anger at me was much more righteous and justified than mine had been. So she very rightly called me out on that. When we got in the car, on the drive back home, I just immediately started getting more and more embarrassed because not only did I treat someone in a way that they didn't deserve and that we should just never treat people, period, I did it in front of my young kids. They were standing there watching me. I did it in front of the people who were standing behind the counter, the other people who were eating in the restaurant. Just horrible. It makes me kind of start like sweating just thinking about it. I started thinking about how that restaurant was less than a mile down the road from this place that I worked. And, this place I work is a church. And, that my job at that church is as a minister. That's interesting. And it's just about a mile away. And so who in that restaurant that watched me behave that way would want to go to a church where that guy was a member, not to mention a minister? Nobody. Nobody. So I dropped family off at the house. I drove back to the restaurant, took a deep breath because I was nervous. I went inside. I apologized to that girl because I had to. My anger had gotten the best of me in public over nothing, obviously, and I treated someone in a way that we should just never treat people. And it absolutely hurt my ability to model Christ to other people in that situation. And so all of that is why Paul in his letters says things like, be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. Let your conversation be always full of grace. What a wonderful reminder to all of us all of the time. For all of us to be reflecting on how our anger, our expression of our anger affects others and affects our endorsement of Jesus as Lord. And it's so timely and relevant now because the world is so angry right now, right? People are just livid about so many things and in so many venues. Outrage culture is a term that we've had to come up with to name the problem. And I wish I could say that Christians had been consistently just above that. But unfortunately, I think Christians are too often enmeshed in that outraged, angry culture rather than being the countercultural example that Jesus calls for in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I do want us to consider three realms, three areas in our life where we really need to assess our conduct, where we really need to manage our anger. The first one kind of goes along with my own embarrassing example, and it's this: how do we control our anger in public? How are we controlling and managing our anger when we are in the eyes of others? How do you treat the server in the restaurant when the slightest thing isn't right? What do you like as a driver? I don't like asking myself that one either, frankly. Step back and look at the version of yourself that shows up to your kids' sporting events. What's that person like? Yikes, right? For some of us, yikes. What do you like online? Your social media presence, your online persona, it absolutely counts. Remember, people are forming perceptions of not just us, but perceptions of who and what we represent by the way that they see us act. And by the way, that's not unfair. Sometimes we act like that's not fair. I hear people say sometimes when they're caught in bad behavior, well, that's not me. That's their apology or their excuse. I get what they're saying. All of us don't want to be caught at our worst. We all have better selves that we hope we live as most of the time. But at some point, the things we do, the things we say, yeah, that is us. And so that is not unfair. How are we managing our anger in public? Secondly, this goes for people all along the spectrum, by the way. How are we controlling our anger and conducting ourselves in our politics? Yeah, we all know it. I'd be silly not to bring that up in a lesson like this, because there aren't many areas where people get as defensive and as bristly and just plain mad as they do when we're talking about politics. And yeah, there's a way to hold your beliefs passionately. There's a way to have discussions that are passionate about a number of different political issues and whatnot. But there is also a line. There's a line at which it goes from passionate discussion into angry rant that needs to be reined in and checked. Culture, people all around us get ugly and mean and personal really fast when it comes to politics. And so a person stands out when their voice in the discussion is calm and gentle and loving and reasonable. Sometimes a person stands out when their voice is pointedly absent from the conversation to begin with. Some of us need to take that advice from time to time. It's not that we can't participate, but we do have to be above the fray in our politics. So how are we managing our anger in public, in our politics, and how are we controlling our anger in our personal lives? For some of us, our anger doesn't get checked just because we walk through the front door. For others of us, we do a really good job, actually, controlling our anger in public, only to save our worst for those who are closest to us. Are we acting out, lashing out to those family and friends who are the closest to us? Maybe we're using excuses, rationalizations like, it's fine, they understand, I don't mean it. Or what am I supposed to do? I've got to have an outlet somewhere. I've got to have somebody to vent on. Who's it going to be if not them? Or maybe they're saying, hey, they're supposed to see the best and the worst of me. They've got to love me for better and for worse. Well, that's us taking a kernel of truth in each one of those rationalizations and warping it, abusing it in a way that's just flawed. Because those justifications, those are unfair to our loved ones. They're unworthy of someone who's trying to live the life that Jesus describes. So if you can look at yourself as objectively as it's possible to look at yourself in those three areas, in public, in politics, in your personal life, and you see a person who is consistently challenged and who consistently struggles to keep his or her anger from flaring up, well, then you're seeing it a person who's likely not representing the God that you serve as well as you could. And so it's time to start praying very specifically, if you haven't yet already, about this issue, about this anger issue. It's time to possibly look to close confidants, maybe to church leaders, maybe to Celebrate Recovery, maybe to a counselor. Get some assistance for a problem that, by the way, many, many people have a really hard time with. Before we move on, I want to say a quick word about righteous anger. Anger in and of itself is not bad. It's not evil inherently. Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. So it's not the anger itself that is sinful. It doesn't take very long in the Scriptures to see that there are plenty of times where anger is a justified, appropriate response. It's actually helpful in some cases. We see about the wrath of God, and we see Jesus turning over tables in the temple and whatnot. So clearly, the anger that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 5 is anger of the unrighteous sort. It's anger that is born out of pride or malice or envy and the like. It's anger that should be checked, that should be controlled, but is not. Now, obviously, an example like me in that Brahms, that's unrighteous anger. I would never try to pretend otherwise. But I think that sometimes we are guilty of justifying some of our expressed anger as being of the righteous sort, even though it probably doesn't belong in that category. Or maybe it did at one point, but it's tilted over into something that needs to be checked, that needs to be reined in. And so I really want to caution us today, and again, I'm going to say, especially in that political realm, where this really seems to pop up, to place our self-described righteous anger under some serious scrutiny. Because when I read about anger that's expressed righteously in the Bible, it seems to me that it's primarily to either defend the sovereignty of God or to defend the disenfranchised. And so, asking ourselves the question, who are you angry on behalf of, seems to me to be a pretty good question to ask. Because if we're angry on behalf of our God, if we're angry on behalf of others, especially those without a strong voice in this world, well, it may well be that anger is exactly what's called for to a point. But I think there's a lot of anger expressed and couched as something righteous that, when we're being really honest with ourselves, primarily is concerned with one's own self-interests. And that's not a good thing. And so let's just be sure that we're on the right side of that equation, that even when we are, that truly righteous anger is slow to rise and quick to die down. So if the first kind of anger that Jesus describes is that outward kind, the observable, public lashing out kind, the second example that he gives is something damaging that lives underneath the surface. And so it's a really clear instruction that he gives here. It's very stark, actually. You remember that he says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gifts there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come back and offer your gift. Now, it's interesting that Jesus gives this instruction to reconcile to the person who isn't necessarily angry himself. I was kind of remembering that backwards until I kind of got back into it and was reading it. I was thinking he was giving this instruction to go reconcile to the person who had something against his brother. But it's actually the other way around. And so what the teaching actually does, it also serves as a really clear message, strong message about the importance of expedient and freely offered forgiveness. So it's also about that. But still, regardless of whether both people in this example are angry, usually that's the case, but we don't know for sure. Whether that's the case or not, I think the overarching teaching is the same here, and it's this. Unresolved anger that festers diminishes your worship. Unresolved anger that festers diminishes your worship. I think it's so crucial this morning. We see the import, the consequences, the ramifications of what Jesus is telling us here. I think it's fairly easy probably for us to see how unchecked and public displays of unrighteous anger are hurtful on a lot of different fronts. That's probably pretty easy to see. I don't think most people want to be known as angry people. But a grudge, resentment, well, that's something that works a little bit differently. That's something that can be housed internally and hidden quite well for a really long time. Maybe the people who are closest to you begin seeing the effects of that, but it's not likely to affect your public standing necessarily. It may not affect your reputation at all. But those dimensions, those considerations aren't the only ones, Jesus is saying. Apart from the horizontal damage of the human relationship itself, which is totally worth salvaging, of course, it also does damage. This festering anger does damage vertically as well. And that might not be as easily or immediately recognizable to us as public outward displays of anger. But Jesus is saying when that festering anger towards someone else takes up residence in us, when it burrows down inside of us, then it becomes an obstacle not only in our relationship with that person, but also with God himself. And so that festering anger is a really dangerous and sinister thing. You know, Phil has talked up here on multiple occasions about his childhood love of Michael Jordan, and I am right there with him. I share that. There will never be another athlete or team. Well, I say there will likely never be another athlete or team that I will be as obsessed with as I was with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls from about age 8 or 9 until the time that he retired. or multiple times that he retired, I guess I should say. That's a little more accurate. I loved watching Michael Jordan play basketball. Every single game I would watch. I still will go back and record old reruns of Bulls games on the NBA channel. If there's one of those on, I'll watch it, which just mystifies Summer. Summer does not understand that at all. But I'll do that. I love watching him play ball. A quick aside here. I want to use this pulpit today. My son has it in his still very developing brain that LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time. I want to use my pulpit today to say real clearly, Bodie, if you're out there, I don't know, Bodie, while you are living under my roof, you live under my rules. And one of those rules is we acknowledge Michael Jordan as the greatest basketball player of all time. End of story. Shape up, son. Now that's some righteous anger right there, properly expressed. That's not why I'm bringing up Michael today. It's become part of Michael Jordan's legend that he was one of the greatest competitors, the most fiercest competitors in any sport ever, and that he would take even the smallest real or perceived slight, and he would kind of use those as fuel for his competitive fire. And it was absolutely a big part of what made him such a successful basketball player. I always thought it was pretty cool. I still think it's pretty cool and impressive how he could take those moments of anger and transform them into motivation on the basketball court to make himself a better basketball player. In 2009, though, he gave a speech during his induction into the Hall of Fame that kind of changed how I viewed those very same qualities about Michael. If you've seen this speech, it is kind of incredible to watch, actually. Basically, he uses the vast majority of his time, his one time to receive the highest honor in his sport, and he uses the majority of that time to call out by name person after person who had doubted him or insulted him, and to just point out to them that they were wrong and that he was right. And I went back and I reread the transcript of that speech this week to see if I was remembering that correctly. It's been 10 years now. And yeah, I kind of was. The first couple of paragraphs where he does that, it's kind of funny. He's kind of a funny guy. He does it in a way that makes you think, oh man, there's that ultimate competitive spirit just coming out again. And then it goes on and on and on. And it's paragraph after paragraph, person after person. It's former coaches. It's high school classmates. It's all kinds of former teammates. It's opposing players. It's front office personnel. It's media members. It goes on, and after a while, it stops seeming funny, and it just begins to curdle into something kind of sour and petty. And this is a man who just seemingly hasn't been able to let go of this anger over old and distant insults, even as he's accepting the highest honor in his field. And so by the end of the speech, I just felt kind of sad for my hero. That was kind of my main emotion. I mean, what should have been his most exultant and joyful moment, and it seemed like he couldn't truly appreciate it because of this festering anger that stood in the way. And I think that's essentially why Jesus cautions us so strongly about letting anger take root in us. It's not that we can't function because of it. It's not even that it completely defines us as people. Just this last week, I read this awesome story about how Michael Jordan just opened up medical clinics in Charlotte to serve people in disenfranchised communities, which is awesome. That's fantastic. But there is a reason why Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, says, don't let the sun go down on you while you are still angry. Many of us know these words of Paul, but he's echoing the immediacy urged from Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. When anger is unresolved, when resentment and grudges are allowed to fester, they do erode our ability to fully connect with the maker of the universe, with our maker. And so this morning, I want us to see the plainness of Jesus' teaching here. Let's see how he lays it out for us. He says, God would rather you stand up, get up from where you're sitting, your pew, in this auditorium. You're in a worship service right now. You're worshiping God. That's pretty important, right? Aren't many places that are more important than this. He'd rather you get up, go out to the back, get your phone, get in your car, whatever, and go make that damaged relationship right than he would you continue to sit here and give him less than your best because anger is standing in the way of doing that. It might not feel like that. That might seem extreme, but Jesus' words here are really clear. And so if someone is angry with you and you know that, reconciliation is just as much your responsibility as it is the other party, maybe even more so. And if you're holding on to anger against someone this morning, it is absolutely, it might not feel like it, but it is absolutely eroding your ability to come into the presence of God fully. And Jesus is saying, let that anger go, make that situation right. He doesn't offer any qualifiers like, well, unless you're totally in the right, unless you're definitely in the right, or unless it's been so long that it's probably a lost cause by now. What he says is unequivocally, this is important enough to stop what you are doing right now, even if what you're doing right now is worshiping God, and to fix this situation that's born of anger right now. No excuses. Murder, killing, those things might not seem particularly relevant to you. I frankly hope that they don't. But we all get mad. We all get angry. The question Jesus wants us to consider about that is, are you controlling your anger, or is your anger controlling you? Because if we allow our anger consistent footholds, it will diminish our ability to worship in spirit and in truth, which is going to stunt our growth as believers. And it will diminish our ability to witness to others the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus, who gave everything for us and then gave to us who have chosen to follow him this incredible honor, but yes, this incredible responsibility to be his representatives here on earth, to endorse him to others during our time on this planet. And so our actions, our words, our behaviors, our beliefs, they represent not only ourselves, they represent our families, they represent our church, they represent our God. So let's lift our eyes up this morning. Let's see that higher standard that God has called us to as we leave this room here, and we leave this building, and we go out and we live our lives this week and beyond. If we can pray for you this morning, we want to do that. If you need to be baptized into Jesus Christ, you can do that this morning. Whatever your need is, come on down here to the front and tell us about it while we stand up and while we sing.